the New York City's Climate Mobilization Act, which is sort of an umbrella, sort of a group of legislation, of which in which is included Local Law 97. I'm going to talk about what it is. I'm going to get into what it isn't and sort of dispel a couple of misconceptions, and then take a further dive into the numbers. After that, we'll start explaining about what the requirements are for compliance, what exactly compliance means, and then identify what sort of exemptions and qualifications buildings have to go alternative pathways of compliance or that don't need to comply whatsoever. We'll get into some steps about how you determine where your building stands, how your building must comply, and then give some tips about an action plan for your building. Lastly, we'll go into penalties and fines, which we'll mention, from time to time across the presentation, but we'll sort of recap all of those in a nice slide at the end of it. And then with whatever remaining time we have, hopefully there should be, at least 15 minutes of free time afterwards. We'll open up the floor for Q&A. And if we can't get to everything, just know that, Haya and our panelists will be able to sort of intake questions, and I'll be able to assist with anything after the presentation. So let's dive into it. So the Climate Mobilization Act, what is that? So in April of 2019, New York City introduced a collection of laws, bills, and resolutions, which represented one of the most comprehensive and ambitious attempts to reduce greenhouse gases by any city in the country, let alone the world. So amongst other portions of the act that relate to phasing out of gas-fired power plants and assessment of wind-driven renewable power sources, the act laid out pathways and requirements to significantly curb the effects and reduce the contributors to climate change through the year 2050. So a few laws that have also been sort of mentioned in this grand spotlight that relate to buildings specifically. Local Law 92, which was reinforced by 94. This accounts for sustainable roofing zones. So any new buildings or alterations where the roof assembly is essentially being replaced, that roof needs to be covered by a sustainable roofing zone for 100% of that alteration. So this can include solar PV panels, green roofs, or a combination of both. Local Law 95, which covers energy grades and certificate displays, it's a very sort of ripe and fresh law specifically for this month, because starting in 2020, all buildings after a certain date need to display their energy grade certificate on the front of their buildings. So for those of you who are familiar with restaurant health grades that show A, B, C, D grades, this is going to be a very similar sort of display. So for those of you, for property managers, building owners, and energy benchmarkers out there, now's the time to make sure that you go into DOB now, download your energy certificate. If your building is indeed subject to benchmarking, get those printed and post those by the end of the month. There's also Local Law 96 PACE financing, PACE being property assessed clean energy, to fund upgrades relating to energy and resource conservation in your buildings. Essentially, this is the city laying out a framework and a system for private lenders to be more readily available to give and finance any sort of projects that relate to energy efficiency or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But for Local Law 97, the centerpiece of the act, what this is saying beginning in 2024, a single building over 25,000 square feet or multiple buildings over 50,000 square feet combined on a single tax lot, pay attention to that, this is a single tax lot, must keep their greenhouse gas emissions below annual limits. Now, Local Law 97 isn't a building code, it's a law. So codes are prescriptive requirements that buildings must meet as a baseline to exist and operate altogether. A law doesn't say a building can't run or exist, it just says that you can do what you want building, but I'm going to penalize you if you're a really bad performer, but I'm not going to penalize you if you are an excellent performer. And when I say performer, in this context, it's just how many CO2 emissions is your building responsible for. So these annual limits will start in 2024, become stricter in 2030, then even stricter in 2035, surprise, then even stricter in 2040, and at its strictest to date in 2050. So generally, this will result in greenhouse gas emissions across the city being reduced by 40% in 2030, generally speaking, and 80% in 2050. So why 80%, why 80% by 2050? Lining up with scientific studies around the world and with the mission statement of the Paris Climate Accord from 2015, these targets line up with global industry recognized recommendations to limit the increase of the average global temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius 30 years from now. And what are these otherwise catastrophic climate effects, such as increasingly high sea levels, more heat waves across the summer? Measurable, palpable effects will be felt if we don't act substantially. So back to those numbers. Of the 80% of the emissions that the city is trying to reduce, the biggest contributor to those emissions at the moment are buildings themselves, which account for nearly 70 to 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And what does that really look like from now, 2020 until 2050? So really, the reduction comes from a 2005 baseline study that New York City carried out on its buildings, and then use that to look towards the future and say, this is the target we need to meet. So again, it's requiring the whole collective average of New York City to reduce its emissions across all sectors by 40% by 2030, 80% by 2050. What local law isn't, it does not require each and every building to reduce by the same amount. It doesn't require every building to go to reduce 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. The idea is that certain buildings that are really good performers don't have to take such drastic measures as those that are bad performers. So really, the law is really going to be felt by the 25% or so buildings that are the worst performers out of the bunch. And then as the limits get stricter and stricter, when 2030 hits, 2035 hits, then more of the buildings will come into the fold and thus be required to reduce their emissions. So what does that mean? I mean, there's several different types of buildings. Energy Star Portfolio Manager recognizes, several dozens of different types of building sectors. But what does Local Law 97 recognize? So it gets as granular right now as 15 different space types. And you're looking at them right here. They're assembly, business as an accessory to healthcare facilities, education, factory, high hazards, 4 types of institutions, mercantile, 2 types of residentials, storage, and then utility/miscellaneous, which can into several different categories. For those of you who are familiar with energy benchmarking, using Energy Star Portfolio Manager, again, as mentioned before, that has several dozen types of categories. And something I'll get into later in this presentation is that the rules around which Local Law 97 will be enforced, those have not been identified and formulated yet. It's going to be another few years until, RCNY rules are out there that really dictate the way with which Local Law 97 is implemented, the format of everything, the process of everything, but the spirit of Local Law 97 is in its language right now. So one of those rules that has yet to be developed is, how does Energy Star, and there's several more categories, translate into these 15 categories? So that has yet still to be determined, but with some just general logic, you can look at one use and look at another. So, you can talk with your benchmarker or other sort of energy or building consultants to help you identify which use is more suitable for your building. And to look then at even more granular, how are GHGs or greenhouse gases calculated? It's according to certain sources. So right now, Local Law 97 identifies 5 main utility sources: grid electricity, number 4 fuel oil, number 2 fuel oil, natural gas, and district steam. So at the moment, they only have coefficients, if you will, that multiply a unit of each one of these utilities and sources to an equivalent ton of CO2. And right now, as it stands, grid electricity is the most carbon intensive, with District Steam being the least carbon intensive. And most of these line up with the coefficients identified by EPA, though these coefficients are more sort of representatives of the cleanliness of the infrastructure and the systems that distribute these fuels, and of the plants and the origins where these fuels are produced. So right now, 2024 through 2029 attribute these values to it. So even though grid electricity is at the most carbon intensive at the moment, pay really close attention to this, because power plants around like Zone J and New York City and New York State are going to get progressively greener. The electric grid is going to be progressively just cleaner in general. So we're going to see a lot of sort of substantial decreases in these coefficients in years to come, potentially for grid electricity to slide over to the right. So maybe a further look into these numbers. From that bar graph that we saw that showed 15 different space types, we're going to hyper-focus into one specific one, just as an example. So what you're looking at right here is the baseline from which Local Law 97 is trying to reduce this entirely to 80% by 2050. So the metric that Local Law 97 recognizes are tons of CO2, and the limits that it attributes to certain building types are on a square foot basis. So for the sake of saving yourselves a bunch of zeros and decimal points, we're just converting in this bar graph tons to kilograms. And for those sort of explanations, unit of measurement used to quantify CO2 emissions from buildings. 1 metric ton equals approximately 2,200 pounds or 1,000 kilograms. So we'll just do a one easy 1 to 1,000. And then carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, is the number of metric tons of CO2 with the same global warming potential as 1 metric ton of an equivalent greenhouse gas. And then, so what you see here is Local Law 97's expectation for residential buildings and their properties to be at. So if you're a building that's 100,000 square feet, you need to multiply that by 6.75 to get your annual limit of how many kilograms of CO2 you're allowed to emit. So 6.75 times 100,000, it's not here, 6.75 million. So, or 675,000, yes, tons or kilograms per year. Now, something to note here is that thus far, only the ranges for 2024 and 2029 and 2030 to 2034 have been identified so far. So what you're going to be seeing on a lot of these graphs and these charts are an asterisk next to any sort of annual limits 2035 and beyond. The reason for that is because those exact limits have not yet been defined. And by the time that the beginning of 2023 comes around, the city should have more precise units on this. But the reason why we're putting 1.4 here as sort of the end goal for 2050 is because that Local Law 97 says, even though we don't know exactly what the incremental limits are going to be up to 2050, the overall goal is to bring the collective average of buildings emissions to a point of 1.4 kilograms per square foot across all buildings. So this is just sort of an estimate at this point. So any sort of penalties or values that we see for those years are purely estimates and sort of guesses about what they could be. But let's wait until 2023 to get more exact numbers. So let's see. Those should be elsewhere, pardon me. So you'll be seeing those bar graphs later in the slides. So let's do an example here, just a very sort of simple basic calculation. Let's assume that this is a simple building, purely residential, one use type, nothing more than that, and that its gross square feet, it is about 130,000 square feet. And just to note, the square footage that is used for the sake of this law is that's recognized by the Department of Finance of New York City. So with 130,000 square feet of purely multifamily residential properties, that being R2, let's assume that the latest benchmarked greenhouse gas emissions for this building was 573.4 tons of CO2e. So now the values that I showed you in the earlier bar graph, such as 6.75 kilograms, that can be converted to metric tons. So for the sake of matching up with values that the law recognize, let's use these values over here. So then what you do is you multiply these coefficients times the square footage down here, and then you'll get how many tons of CO2 your building is allowed to emit. Now again, the reason why these ones are grayed out is because those limits have still yet to be defined, but we've just estimated them for the time being. Then you take the actual tons that your building last reported, let's assume in 2019, and then you take the difference between that and the respective allowable limits for these years, and then you'll see the delta between what your building emitted and what it's allowed to emit. Now keep in mind, we're only basing this off of the latest data that's available to us, that being what a building emitted in 2019. When we get to these years, what they're going to care about is that year and nothing else. They're not going to take the limits in 2027 and apply that to what your building emitted in 2019. They're going to care about what's the limit in this year and what did you emit that like last year. It's shown, they want to see proof, actual data of what you do in real time in that year. So in this example, in the first year, the first range of years, 2024 to 2029, this building is well under the limit. Therefore, there's no penalty. It complies with Local Law 97. However, as we get to stricter years, this and many other buildings out there are going to see themselves really close to this limit or way over it. So in this case, it's 44.3 tons over the limit. And when you account the penalty that Local Law 97 says, 44.3 tons times the penalty of, get this, $268 per ton over the limit, then you will be experiencing or subject to penalties 5 digits, $11,872 every year. And then as the limits get even stricter, your fines are going to be even more. So you account this for several years in a row, and then for another 5 years later, your penalty will only get stricter. You've got a long pathway of money that you're going to have to fork over later if you don't invest now in capital improvements to make sure that your emissions are lower now. So this is sort of like a graphical representation of that. Green when you're below the limit, red when you're above the limit. So that delta is what you're going to be paying for in penalties. And just sort of a graphical representation of the annual penalty that you would pay in that example. So that was sort of a rundown of simple calculations for a building that is assumed to comply, no special criteria, no special exemptions, but obviously this law goes beyond just simple basic calculations. That's why we're here to present this to you, because there are pathways to determine whether your building actually complies, is exempt from reducing its emissions, or whether the law applies to your building whatsoever. So let's go through that. These following pages will help you determine the answers to those questions and guide you through the next steps. So there's going to be a few terms that I'll throw around here and definitions I'd like to just relay here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what benchmarking is it's an activity that has been stipulated by Local Law 84 and 133 to annually report energy, water, and greenhouse gases that a building is responsible for consuming and emitting over the course of the calendar year. So these are usually handled by a combination of building ownership and professional engineers who submit reports to capture and memorialize to the City of New York how much water it consumes, how much energy it consumes, its square footage, and then this data is all publicly available on New York City's open data website. penalty assessments, and that's what I just did with that sample building earlier. Energy audits, and this is another local law required activity, but it's not exclusive to local law 87. It's essentially where certified energy auditors come visit an existing building, take a run through every single feature of the building that deals with energy consumption, that being lighting systems, heating systems, ventilation systems, heating hot water systems, all the bunch, takes inventory, basically gives it a health check, and then gives it a report card with recommendations of including low hanging fruit and deep energy sort of conservation measures that will help yield future savings and payback periods and will improve the overall efficiency of the building. And that's required for buildings over 50,000 square feet to do every 10 years. There's financing improvements and compliance through, as I mentioned before, PACE. There's also Con Edison and NYSERDA sort of sponsored incentives that come into the fold from time to time. And then there's things like renewable energy credits and greenhouse gas offsets, which are sort of certificates that buildings can purchase to benefit their penalty score or their emission score. And there's applications for exemptions or relaxed limits. So there's exemptions, which not all buildings of a certain size have to comply with this law. There are some buildings which just don't have the physical sort of means to do these, to reduce their emissions, or others, because of their special use, are sort of like forgiven from reducing their emissions. And then design, construction, and implementation, or design, build, and implementation. So basically taking the long-term plan to improve the building's performance through retrofits, through equipment replacement, through window replacement, and basically engaging consultants to design these improvements, relaying them to contractors to build these improvements, and then implementation of these improvements through testing, balancing, commissioning, basically turning all the knobs, testing everything, pressing the go button, making sure that everything is running well. And then lastly, there's local law 97 report submission. So these are just, several of many other sort of things that constitute and make up sort of a long-term action plan when it comes to seeing your building's pathway towards local law 97 from now until 2050. And your building will progressively see itself become leaner, stronger, and much more energy efficient as it channels its inner sort of Captain America or Admiral Atmosphere, whatever you want to call them. So I understand this content has been quite a bit verbose, as is the law itself, but I think these visuals right here, we put together some sort of decision flow diagram that helps make a bit more sense of local law 97 and how you sort of go through this and figure out, does my building need to comply? Do I even need to care about this law? Or can I go through alternate compliance methods in order to comply? So let's go to the beginning. First question is, how many buildings are on the tax lot? Okay, let's assume that it's just one for now. Next, is your building over 25,000 gross square feet? Let's say no. That's easy. You don't have to comply. And if we don't know exactly if buildings have to submit annual reports saying, I'm a small building, I therefore don't need to comply, there's a good chance that the way that local law 84 and local law 87 rules are written right now, they usually upload a spreadsheet every year saying these are the buildings that need to comply. So the city almost has done a bit of homework to say, we know which buildings are exempt or we know which buildings don't apply to this. So if you don't see yourself on this list, don't worry about it. But again, there's still rules that have yet to be developed where we'll have to figure out how this is recognized. But in any case, let's assume that the building is over 25,000 gross square feet. Okay, so are these buildings, or is this building that is of the appropriate size, is it a covered building per local law 97 definition? So this is a very important facet of the law. Essentially, a covered building, as it's defined in this law, is a building that is required to comply with the law by reducing its emissions below the respective limits. However, if your building is not a covered building, you don't have to reduce your emissions, but you still have to comply. And this is a very important thing to take note of. You don't necessarily have to comply by taking drastic measures to lower your emissions, but you still are required to perform routine maintenance and prescriptive commissioning measures on your building systems and report such activity to the New York City Department of Buildings. So we're going to cover those definitions of what a covered building is next. So right now, the law as it's written recognizes 7 different types of buildings as non-covered buildings. So those are an industrial facility, primarily for electric power or steam generation. There's real property, not more than 3 stories of semi-attached dwellings or attached dwellings, basically small residential properties. Then there's any city buildings, though they are being held to different sort of standards for energy reduction. There's housing developments or buildings on land owned by NYCHA. For residential sort of buildings here, a rent-regulated accommodation is not considered a covered building. But an important sort of piece of legislation to keep an eye for is 1947. So right now, Local Law 97 recognizes a building that has 1 unit rent regulated as the whole building being rent regulated. So even if a building has 20 units or 200 units, if only 1 apartment or 1 unit is rent regulated, then the whole building is defined as rent regulated in the eyes of this law. However, this bill could potentially increase that requirement from 1 unit to 35% of all units in the buildings. So this legislation, or sorry, this bill currently had a hearing about a few weeks ago. So we're keeping a close eye on that, as that will certainly shift the landscape of which buildings need to comply, which buildings need to reduce their emissions, and which ones need to take prescriptive measures. The 6th definition is any sort of place exclusively for worship. And then for tax experts out there, if your building is pursuant to Business Corporation Law or Article 11, then your building's not considered covered. So of those 7, if none of those apply to your building and your building meets those square footage criteria, then you must reduce your carbon CO2 emissions. But if only one of those applies, then you are qualified for an alternative pathway. And there's 2 things you can do. You can choose to go the regular way. That is, if your building already has lower CO2 emissions. You figured, okay, well, if I already am a good performer, why not just demonstrate that to the city, regardless of my status? So I'm good. Very little, if any, effort done. However, the other thing you can do is, if you find that your building does have CO2 emissions above the annual limit, then you don't have to reduce your emissions, but you can engage a retro-commissioning agent to perform these 13 sort of prescriptive pieces of work, which mostly deal with, the standard sort of routine maintenance that would result from Local Law 87, not retro-commissioning. But it's just looking at standard sort of features of lighting controls, lighting systems, sealing leaky parts of the building and the piping systems, just basically going into your building with a doctor and just tightening up its energy usage. So right now, for any building that meets any of those previous 7 definitions, you need to do these activities by the end of 2024 to be accepted for this. So you have 4 years to do this right now. The law currently doesn't say whether this pathway will apply for future years, but again, rules have still yet to be established for that. So going back here, this was essentially what I described to you is this sort of stage over here. If your building was not a covered building, if it did meet the emissions limits, as I'm bringing this over here, you can continue to just submit a report annually to New York City demonstrating compliance. But if the building was over the limit, then you can perform that prescriptive retrocommissioning and submit to New York City by 2024. Now, for those buildings that don't meet any of those exceptions, then we follow the same questions, but in the cases where the building does not comply or whose emissions limits or emissions exceed the limit, then the steps and the long-term planning gets a lot more involved, a lot more complex, depending specifically on how poor of a performer you are. So let's look at, say, an example where a building is right now emitting more CO2 than the first upcoming years of 2024. So question, does your building comply with local 97 emissions limits for the years 2024 to 2029? No. Okay. Does your building exceed that limit by more than 40% in the year 2018? Basically saying, is your building a really particularly bad performer? So in the case where your building was worse than the upcoming limit, but not by 40%, it's recommended to take action by 2023. That would be starting now. But in the case where it is a severely poor performer, there are certain facilities that qualify for relaxed limits. Basically, the city's saying the goal line's over here, like way far away from you, but we'll bring it a little closer for you because we know it's going to take a lot for you to come meet us over here. So there are a couple of criteria that certain buildings qualify for this relaxed limit pathway. Mission critical, or better, I put mission critical here because really the law recognizes certain healthcare facilities or certain facilities that are critical to human health and safety. So maybe not the mission critical as it's defined necessarily in the consulting industry. So if your building is 40% worse than the upcoming limit, and it is a facility such as a not-for-profit hospital or healthcare facility, in those cases, you can apply for relaxed limits. So in those cases, there's two types. If you're a facility that has operations that are 24/7, that are super high density, that are critical to human health and safety, what you must do is submit an improvement plan to the city by July 1st of next year. And that improvement plan should incorporate things like what sort of plan improvements and upgrades and replacements you're going to be doing over the next 10 years. A good way to sort of get that plan in place is to do an energy audit before that. So by the time that July 1st comes around, if you get that application to New York City, the city will allow you to simply reduce your building's current emissions by 30% by 2024 and 50% by 2029. So, and then if you're a hospital or healthcare facility, you don't necessarily have to submit a plan, but you just need to submit an application to allow for reduction for your building just to reduce its current energy usage and emissions by 15% by 2024 and 30% by 2029. So that essentially just looks like if you just go back and forth from here. So right now, the way the limits are spelled out, it's putting together like objective targets that are specific to the baseline that was carried out in 2005. But this relaxed limit only wants you to reduce your building's specific emissions by 15% or 30%. So that's in the case for certain buildings that are allowed to get a bit of forgiveness. But in the cases where a building does not meet that criteria, then it's recommended for buildings to take action with a lot more involved. So what does that look like? This isn't necessarily specific to any building, but this is kind of like an example that could be, you know, tweaked and modified to suit a lot of different buildings. So first thing to do is, once you know where your building lies, is, okay, let me actually get into the building and do an energy audit. Let me do some inspections and surveys. If you can somehow line that up with your local law 87 requirements, you can kill two birds with one stone by complying with local law 87 10-year energy audits, and then putting yourself in the position to have a menu of items to improve your energy performance and your emissions. So from there, you can create an action plan from the energy audit report, including financing for these improvements. And then once you have a whole list of items, you know, engage your building owners and property managers to really gauge, you know, what's their appetite for short-term, mid-term, and long-term improvements. What sort of budgets do they have? What financing options are available? What sort of incentives are available? And then from there, make decisions about what we can do now versus holding off on later, and then design, build, and implement that. And then at that point, when the year 2024 comes around, that's when you start reporting annually to the city. And then if you need to revisit that same action plan again, sometime by 2030 or 2034, it's more or less the same action. So it's a multi-tiered or phased approach towards a much more greener building towards 2050. And I'm not going to go through each one of these now, but there's a lot of detail here. But essentially, it's if you're over a certain limit, there is an absolute max time that you want to make sure your action's been taken and your improvements have been done. So if you find yourself over the limit for 2024, you want to make sure you've taken action and completed your work by 2023. Else you'll be subject to penalties. If you're over the limit in 2030, you want to take action by 2029. I think you get the picture. So I mentioned penalties already to some degree, but just to sort of recap what those look like. So they're very steep fines, and building owners will be fined $268 per metric ton that their carbon footprint exceeds specified limits annually. So, you know, for a million square foot building, you know, if you're emitting 100 tons over the limit, actually, never mind, that's a different limit. The square footage really comes into play when you're late. So that's something you don't want to do. So your failure to file a report on time is arguably the steepest of them all, especially for bigger buildings. So for every month that you're late, your building will be subject to a fine of 50 cents per square foot per month. Yeah, that's, I'm shaking in my boots and I don't own a building. So, but anywho, and then lastly, for falsified reports, there's a fine of up towards of $500,000 and or 30 days of imprisonment for basically the representative of the building. So I'm sure there's more Q&A coming. There have been a sort of handful of common questions coming my way over the past few weeks. So what happens if, you know, through all of the like available means of design and construction, that I'm still unable to basically reduce my carbon emissions? So there's a few pathways you can do. Let's suppose that a building in a certain year is only, say, 5% away from the limit. So you can do things such as purchasing greenhouse gas offsets to lower your building's counted emissions by no more than 10%. You can also purchase renewable energy credits to lower your building's total counted emissions, but to what degree those can be actually used. There are sort of carbon trading studies that are going on right now that will determine that percentage, hopefully. We should hopefully have more information about that next year or potentially by 2023. What happens if what happens if a building can't afford to make all the necessary modifications by the time the deadline hits? So, you know, as mentioned before, New York City is in the process of formalizing programs to assist building owners in complying with the set limits via Local Law 96. So PACE, which is established in several states across the country, this is essentially New York City establishing a New York City specific PACE program that puts private lenders much more available and within reach of building owners and developers who are looking to finance renewable energy systems and features within buildings. You can have a look on New York City's EEC website. You can also ask us for contacts and information of people who can help you look at PRAISE financing. And even after all available loan programs, incentives and offsets, even after that, if your building still can't reduce its limits and would be subject to a financial hardship to comply with the law, there are still case-by-case scenarios where a building can relax limits through 2029, and in some cases through 2034, but not forever. It's only for like anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Eventually, these sort of relaxed limit programs aren't meant right now to extend the life of Local Law 97 to 2050. They really only outline these relaxed limits for the next 10 to 15 years. So, as mentioned before, there's still a few things that need to be clarified. Local Law 97, won't take effect until 2024. So there's still 3 years or so for the rules to be established. So again, we talked about what we know, but what have we yet to know? So we don't know exactly what the limits are going to be from 2035 to 2049 and 2050 and beyond. We don't exactly know right now how Local Law 97 and the EPA will determine the carbon intensity of energy sources 2030 and beyond. But those mentioned earlier, I think trends will show that the electric grid is going to be on a trend of decreasing its carbon intensity significantly through the cleaning up of the grid throughout New York State. We don't know exactly how Local Law 97 reports will be formatted. Again, we don't know how many renewable energy credits a building's allowed to use to reduce their penalty. We still have yet to hear from that legislation that will either keep rent-regulated buildings from only needing 1 unit in the building to be rent-regulated, or whether 35% of units need to be rent-regulated. We still need to wait to see if the prescriptive retro-commissioning pathway for non-covered buildings will need to occur every 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. We still don't know that. And then how often buildings will need to prove that they're not covered. That might also be in the form of an annual report, but we shall see. There's also how landmark buildings can relax their emissions on an annual basis. Again, how they prove and how they sort of memorialize their status and how that plays into their limits. And also the cadence with which buildings can claim financial hardship to relax their limits. But again, we said in the previous slide, that can only happen those limits can be relaxed for a period of 1 to 3 years, but how often can they do that? So it's still really early for those rules, but it's never too early for your building to take action. So to sort of wrap things up, Local 187 goes beyond sustainability and avoiding hefty penalties. For us, this is our responsibility. We at PVE here are committed to the cause of reducing global warming and curbing climate change. This commitment goes beyond waving the flag of sustainability and going green, and we hope it goes beyond avoiding penalties for everybody. This commitment is rooted in our inherent responsibility to look after the welfare of the environment and those who inhabit it. We hope that this webinar clarifies how Local Law 97 impacts you, shines a light on pathways towards developing an action plan for your building and your company, helping you maximize your part in New York City's collective responsibility to curb climate change and set a leading example for the country and the world to follow. So with that, I thank you. I understand that was a lot of content, a lot of talk, but I understand that there could be a lot of questions. So we'll do what we can in these last 15 minutes to answer whatever one's Hangout relays need from the audience. And if you have any further questions beyond what was submitted, please feel free to email me directly at dcv@pve-llc.com or check out our website for more information.
David, thank you very much. That was a tremendous amount of information, very well laid out for everyone. There have been a number of questions about the slides. We've basically said, no, we're recording this video but the slides themselves will not be individually available. But please do reach out to David directly. And what I neglected to say at the beginning is if you've written a question, it is connected to your email address, and David and his team will get all of the questions. So we have some we're going to go through now, but if we don't get to them all, please know that they will be received by David and PVE, and they'll get back to you on them. David, I'm not sure the first question's one you and I spoke about yesterday. I'm not sure you'll be the expert for the answer, but why are NYCHA and all city buildings exempt? Our first question wants to know, shouldn't the city lead by example?
So and that's a good question. So beyond, and this is something I need to look more into, but there are sort of pieces of literature out there that say they actually have plans to reduce their energy consumption by a certain percentage. And I believe Urban Green Council has some more literature on this, but they're not exempt. They're just not held to the standards of Local Law 97, and which is more based on the private sector of buildings. So there is a separate sort of there are separate plans for the public sector, but they're not getting away scot-free. They want to lead by example.
Thank you. That is good to know. Brian asks, electric source energy is much higher, hence all fossil fuels converted to electric is creating more greenhouse gas. How does this help? In addition, the electric infrastructure of NYC is already overloaded, and how will electrification be possible?
And this is a really good question. So, you know, it's more than just individual buildings converting to electric systems. This has to happen on a micro and macro scale. So on an individual building level, you know, buildings can help relieve the overloading of the electrical grid by incorporating local renewable energy sources, such as solar PV panels, to sort of reduce the amount of electricity that it takes from the grid. And yes, of course, right now, New York City electric grid could not possibly handle an entire portfolio of buildings that has nothing but electric source systems. There would need to be major upgrades to make that happen. So there's a lot of policy that's being put forth and sort of championed right now to electrify the grid, because renewable plants outside of the city that are main sources of power and energy to the city, they will channel whatever reclaimed energy they can through an electric grid. So we can harness the power of renewable sources through electric grids. So right now, no, it can't handle all electric. And yes, right now it is the electric grid per BTU is the most carbon energy intensive. That being said, more renewable power sources will contribute more renewable power to the grid, therefore reducing that over time. It's very verbose, but there are sort of, there's a lot of literature on New York City's Office of Sustainability talking about electrifying the grid and what we can do to, you know, see that future.
Thank you. And thanks for all the additional references to the Urban Green Council and New York City's Sustainability Office. That's all very helpful as well. David, is there any differences between a co-op and a condo related to these incentives in terms of loans and requirements, as a condo could control common area only compared to a co-op in relation to local law 84, 97, et cetera?
Yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that. I do know that there are certain portions of the law that talk about co-ops, and that I believe that they fall under potentially a non-covered building status. That potentially could be lumped in with the real property, where, you know, tenants or, you know, owners of certain co-ops look after the maintenance of their own systems. So a building landlord doesn't have the sort of, like, there isn't a common building facilities manager or landlord to look after those systems. So therefore they don't have the power or the access to make deep energy improvements to equipment that's not theirs. So I'll try and get back to you specifically on that question if possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm thinking this was from one of the earlier slides. What special use get exempt?
Okay, so So I guess there's two exempts in this case. There's, if you're not a covered building, then you're exempt. But if you're another type of building, you can get your greenhouse gas limits relaxed. So again, like, exempt buildings are any building that is, certain industrial facilities, real properties, of attached, detached, or semi-attached dwelling units of small quantities, city buildings, NYCHA buildings, rent-regulated properties, places of worship, and properties subject to business law and Article 11 of tax law. So those are the buildings that are exempt. But again, exempt means that they just don't have to lower their emissions. They just need to perform certain measures on their building systems to make sure they're running nice and efficiently. So those definitions are covered in one of the slides. And then the other, which deals with buildings that can relax their limits, those generally are healthcare facilities, facilities that run 24/7 that are critical to human health and safety. And then other sort of like energy intensive buildings that are used for the generation of like power or sources and things like that. The law hasn't really gone much further in terms of those definitions, but that's how it's written right now.
And if you do only some, but not all of the prescriptive measures, are you subject to a fine? And then when do these measures have to be done? For example, every year, biennially? Right.
That's a good question. So we don't, the fine right now hasn't been outlined. That has to be done right now before December 31st, 2024. But in terms of, but Local Law 97 lasts for 30 years for now. What the law doesn't say is if you're exempt and you have to carry out those prescriptive measures, it doesn't say how often past 2024 you need to do that. So I think there's more rules that have yet to be authored to really capture that requirement. So right now, for what we know, if your building, you know for sure, is not a covered building and you have to carry out those measures, do so by December 31st, 2024. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time just for one, maybe two more. Eric wants to know, isn't a building owner being penalized now through maybe 2034 to go all electric? First with high electric operating costs, then with increased kilowatt, which will be multiplied by the factor, which is greater than gas-fired heating. So
yeah, potentially yes. I mean, it depends on the type of building too. So, if you're an office building that's going all electric, for example, those tend to have a more even sort of ratio of electric to natural gas fired versus, say, a multifamily residential property, which, you can see almost a 5-to-1 ratio of natural gas to electric. So you're going to see carbon intensity sort of be higher right now. But again, so that's a good question. Like, how do you sort of time your electrical improvements with a grid that doesn't really have a favorable carbon intensity towards electric? Again, this long sort of grand vision of an electrified New York City, and when the grid will get more favorable towards green electrification. There's a lot to it, but yes, that is a good point. Depends on the ratio of sources and utilities in your building.
And Mark would like to know if the calculations for a covered building include directly metered electrical for multifamily or commercial co-ops. I think it's use is what I missed, electrical use.
Yes. So essentially, well, back to the co-op thing. So I'll have to look a bit further into that, but for anything that's direct metered, yes. So it basically needs to total everything from the whole sort of building structure on that given lot. Hopefully that answered your question.
And one of our attendees, Richard, has been letting us know about a resource by the Carbon Trust. And he has said that he's calculated poorly maintained cooling in New York might be responsible for 209 or probably 20 to 25% of the city's stationary energy emissions. So he's got some calculations. If anybody's interested, let us know and I'll connect you with Richard, one of the attendees who's very knowledgeable on this topic as well, apparently.
Please do.
David, I know you've been talking for almost an hour. I'm parched for you. It's a lot of wonderful information. Again, many people have asked about the slides themselves. Shall we ask them just to email you directly for any additional information that the slides mentioned, and then you can follow up? And as mentioned, you'll see all the questions and chats and everything that everybody has asked when you get this report later today. So you'll be able to reply to everybody directly as well. So I thank you very much. A lot of great information, and it's all good to keep everyone as healthy and safe as we all can be. We appreciate all that PVE engineering is doing in this area and wish you all the best of luck. Thank you so much, David. And everyone take care. We hope to see you at the next Buildings NY Unlocked next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.